Meanwhile, more fallout from the return of the death panel debate due to the overwhelming public opposition. Democrats dropped plans to include end-of-life counseling in the health care bill, so President Obama decided to circumvent legislation with regulation through a new Medicare rule that started on Saturday. Now, under the new policy, the government will now pay doctors to advise patients on options for end-of-life care, including the option to opt out of medical treatment that could prolong their lives. Now, defenders of the new rule tried to argue it was nothing more than a continuation of President Bush's policies, but in reality, President Bush actually vetoed that OA bill, which included an end-of-life provision. That policy was passed by a congressional veto override. And joining me now with reaction is former press secretary to GOP Speaker-elect John Boehner, Kevin Madden, Democratic strategist Steve McMahon. Steve, I don't often quote the New York Times on this program, but this is where the story originated. New York Times reports that Medicare will now pay for voluntary end-of-life counseling. Is that something you're comfortable with?
Actually, I am comfortable with it, Sean. I was comfortable with 2008 when it was going on and when the bill passed. And in fact, the bill passed with the House of Representatives with only 59 members of Congress voting against it, which means a majority of Republicans voted for the bill that allowed this to happen. And basically what happens now is seniors can go in and get a checkup every year, and they can talk to their doctor about things, including medical directives, which, you know, I have a medical directive that orders my family to discontinue treatment if I cannot be resuscitated. And seniors now have that option if they'd like to pursue it with their doctor.
Here's the problem with this, Steve, and you ought to know better than this. At the end, when people are elderly and they're not perhaps as capable as you are as a young 40 or 50-something guy. well, you're still a hockey player, so I still remember. But this is the important part. So yeah, but let's say you have an 85-year-old grandmother, 85-year-old grandfather. They go into the doctor, and they're given this option, and they're not capable of making the decision of a young person. And the government's now going to pay doctors to do this. I would think that as a compassionate liberal, you'd have a problem with that. Well,
Sean, if a doctor was encouraging that of a senior citizen who wasn't capable of making a decision, I'd completely agree with you. But what the law allows doctors to be reimbursed for is a conversation, if the patient chooses to have it, with a doctor about medical directives. And Sean, I would say the only thing we have to fear here is fear-mongering itself, and that's what's been going on with this from the very beginning. 59 people voted against this provision in the Congress.
You keep going back to the talking. I don't care about that. Kevin, this is the important part. When this issue came up during the health care debate, most Americans said, no way, that this is lacking in compassion, that people might be put in the position to say, well, you're going to be a burden to your family, you don't want to be a burden to society. So it was stripped from the health care bill. In a sleight of hand, backdoor deal, Obama administration, once again against the will of the American people, slips this in. So isn't that the real story here?
The Democrats lost the debate over this because, in large part, look, I honestly think that the death panels debate, the end-of-life counseling debate, was a very big distraction during the health care reform debate that took place last summer. I think, in large part, the American people rejected this bill because it cost way too much money. It was $1 trillion+ at a time we didn't have it. And it represented a government intrusion into how people get their care. And I think that's the big problem here, that this whole debate is a product of the Democrats' own devise, because they crafted a bill that had too much government involvement, had too much government direction in people's health care. And so when we have this advanced counsel debate now, I think it's poisoned because of the way the Democrats put together a very partisan bill, and one that was too intrusive on the way people went about choosing their own care.
Yeah, you know, Steve, here's how sinister this is in my mind. And again, I go back to my favorite newspaper, the New York Times. The office of Oregon Democrat Earl Blumenauer, he was the author of the original rider who then lobbied Medicare to cover the service. He sends an email out to supporters. In the email, he's cheering this, quote, victory, but he asked, don't tell anyone for fear of perpetuating the death panel myth. So they want to sneak this thing through. They can't win it in a legitimate debate. They can't win it legislatively. They can't win it at the ballot box because no Democrat ran on health care. So they find a backdoor way to literally ram this down people's throats because they can't afford to pay for the health care they're promising everybody.
Well, okay, so that was a compound question, Sean, but I'll take the thrust of it. They didn't jam it down anybody's throats. The provision that was taken out of the health care reform bill actually ordered doctors to have a specific conversation with patients about end-of-life counseling. That was removed from the bill because the public objected to it. The provision that was included in this rule over the weekend is a provision that is exactly the same as what the provision was, not under George Bush's administration because he favored it, but during the time of his administration. And that provision was enabled by a Congress that had 200 Republicans in it, and almost all of them voted in favor of that provision. Now, I understand that this is a great political conversation.
You're not telling the whole story, because every Republican voted against the health care bill.
No, but Sean, this was passed in 2008.
All right,
the provision we're talking about has been in effect since 2008.
And George Bush vetoed it.
But only 59 people in Congress voted against it, which means 2 out of 3 Republicans who were present that day voted for it, Sean.
I'm a registered conservative, so don't tell me what Republicans do. If Republicans don't live up to their conservative principles, believe me, I'll be their fiercest critic.
I'm just telling you what the vote was, Sean.
And I know what the vote. I know that George Bush, but it doesn't make it right. And Kevin, this is the bottom line here. They can't get this passed legislatively, so this is what we're left with. Grandmothers, grandfathers going into a doctor's office getting end-of-life counseling that perhaps may not be in their best interest.
Look, and this is the exact reason that you have folks like Darrell Issa who are going to try and offer really robust scrutiny, really robust oversight of the administration's actions on this bill. What they didn't get into the bill, they're going to try now and use the rulemaking process in order to introduce in order to get what they couldn't get into the bill. So I think that's going to be something that this particular Congress, led by Speaker Boehner and chairmen like Chairman Issa, are going to be very, very vigilant in looking into.
All right, guys, good to see you, and Happy New Year, even to you, Steve.
You too, Sean.
Happy New Year.